Hello and welcome to another pre-recorded session of the IEEE International Symposium on Digital Privacy and Social Media, being held in San Jose, California on the 1st of August 2022. My name is Katina and I'm the Executive Chair of the Symposium. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the main technical sponsor of our event, the IEEE Consumer Technology Society, for making this symposium possible. CTSOC realized that they required a transdisciplinary approach to addressing global pressing issues related to the design and development of consumer technologies and have called for diverse stakeholders to come together to respond to digital privacy requirements and matters pertaining to social media in particular. I would also like to thank for their patronage our gold patron, the IEEE Digital Privacy Initiative, and also our silver patron, the Prototype Company, being led by Darren Calbreth. And of course, for their ongoing support, the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology's Technical Committee on Socio-Technical Systems, led by Dr. Roper Abbas, and the IEEE Santa Clara section, and the CTSOC San Francisco Bay Area chapter. Today, we have with us an eclectic panel. These four individuals have worked in the area of children, digital services, and security, and child-centered policy, who individually, either directly or indirectly, contributed to the development of the IEEE 2089-2021 standard age-appropriate digital services for children. Today, our speakers will deliver initially individual presentations, followed by a brief Q&A on the topic at large. We begin with Nishan Chelvachandran, Chief Executive and founder of Iron Lakes. It's an AI, cybersecurity, and spatial computing company. And Nishan started his career in the police service over a decade ago. He truly understands tactical operation and encourages growth of motivated and effective teams with the human at the core of the delivery. He's published in the field of cybersecurity and cyber warfare and really is a champion of many causes in the equity space. He's a global fellowship counselor for the RSA and an advisor of the IEEE Standards Association Global Expert Panel on Children's Experiences. It's important to note that Nishan's company represents the ability for business to work with non-government organizations and not-for-profits. Nishan's emphasis is the third sector and supporting different organizations to reach their goals with respect to keeping children safe online. Welcome, Nishan.
Thank you, Katina. It's a pleasure to be here, and of course, I'm humbled to be on a panel of such heavyweights and established professionals and experts in this space. So I guess really, my angle to this is really looking at the need, the why. In my experience, and I don't necessarily go into too many very specific examples and highlighting certain companies, not to mention the legal brouhaha that will cause, but I think it's important to just kind of get a good lay of the land. I think a lot of the time, people, of course, know the well-known social media platforms and the sorts of engagement that children, young people, and adults have on these platforms, without having to name any. One of the, I think, the growing, whether it's an issue or a challenge, is that a huge section of the population, of course, being young, under 18, a legal child or young person, engages with these platforms. But these platforms have been designed really with adults in mind. And that's a bit of a broad statement. But when you do look at, I think, or maybe not necessarily designed with adults in mind, but just designed with general interactions. They weren't necessarily designed with children in mind and specific needs. It was just a very broad thing when you look at social media platforms. As their implementations and uses has developed and really integrated within society, now we're finding these platforms being used for all sorts of things and in manners that perhaps they weren't originally designed for, if you see what I mean. One of the big issues, I think, is that from a security point of view, there's always this big focus on privacy. How do we make sure that data is protected, or that only certain people can engage? And even from the child-centric point of view, usually the kind of the goal that the companies try to reach for is being able to prevent people that are too young from engaging on the platform. Stick that barrier up, which is a very traditional approach. If you think of it, reminds me of the old cinema days where you have a PG-13 film, and if you're younger than 13 then you can't see it. And we all know that there are ways and means that we would go to the cinema or find ways to watch these videos, right? So just have this standard barrier to say, well, if you're, or you get this question or this prompt, you must be 13 or over. So are you 13? Yes. Okay, great. And then you have free access, right? And a lot of the focus is on how do we manage young people to either just block them from engaging on the platform, or having these various different mechanisms, parental controls, even lots of different things that stop interactions. And as we know, there are also workarounds. And a lot of the issues I think that are coming up with a lot of these platforms in this Wild West is that where there is a barrier, another application is deployed. There's a lot of these, again, it's difficult to do this without naming specific platforms, but there are various apps, for example, that circumvent inbuilt chat apps. So if we think of a social messaging application that shares photos, and within that platform you have direct messaging, there are apps where you can actually talk about content on this app, but it's on a separate platform. So you circumvent a lot of the controls that the mother platform, let's say, would have. So then the question is, how do you then manage the secondary platform, which has been built purposely to circumvent a lot of these things and engage free speech and everything else? So there's the privacy conversation. But then for me, what I find more interesting, or perhaps equally as important, is actually the effect of these technologies. When you're thinking of young people, when I say kids and young people, I'm thinking about 13-year-olds, people in their formative years going right through to young adulthood. And people that are very much conscious of they're in a phase of self-exploration, self-definition, of learning, figuring out who they are, what they want to do, who they want to be, how they want to be. And they have content that streams to them or fed to them, feeding a particular perception of this is how you should be. And if you don't necessarily fit within this type of prescribed persona, you're an anomaly. And a lot of research is showing that there are a lot of, and actual evidence is showing that is causing a lot of issues and exploding a lot of mental health trauma and issues in young people. And there's been a lot of instances of suicides and whatnot that are connected to that. An interesting look on that as well is so I've just lost my train of thought of where I was going with that in particular. But oh yeah, so one of the big problems with this, and as another example, a lot of this is inbuilt in technology. So moving away from social media, I did some research with some new technology, a technological gimbal. I won't name the name of the company, but they make a lot of drones and other types of devices. So with this selfie gimbal that you put your smartphone on and you utilize it, to take pictures or film your vlogs or your reels or stories, whatever it is that you're filming, there are filters within that now have an option to slim your face. So it's just to slim it, because that's, I guess, you look better if you're slimmer. One, to lighten your face, which I found quite interesting. So according to this filter, if I increase the lightness of my face, it would relate to an increase in viewability. And then there's other things about rosy cheeks and whatnot, but it's quite interesting that there isn't the option to lighten and darken your face, or to, just change your face shape generally. It's very much, seen as a plus to glamorize. It's a glamour feature to glamorize your face. You need to be slimmer, you need to be light, positive view. And I'm sure the designers of these filters haven't thought, in a very dystopian way, thinking, how do we do something that's going to make our users really, self-conscious and everything else. It's just something that they've done. But this is the issue. It's the thinking about not whether we can do something or even whether we should do something, but if we do it, how do we do it appropriately? So for me, if we're going to be operating in this space, and I use we as technologists and in a disciplinary sense, if we are going to be building and operating in this technological society with technological applications and implementations of such systems, we need to incorporate the users into the mix. So there's no point of me saying what's important for kids to be using on a social media app or whatever, because I mean, I'd like to say I'm no longer a kid, maybe it depends on how people perceive me. Maybe I still might come across as a kid, but we need to incorporate, kids within the process. And that's it. I mean, that's easy for me to say. And I think the three others on the panel here will have some actual real insights as to how we do that. And you mentioned 2089 in particular, but really, because there's a lot of legal challenges as well that we've got to come across, explore and everything, right? In terms of how we engage with children and young people who are going to be the predominant users of these applications. How do we build things in a safe way? What does safe even mean? Moving away from the sole security, privacy, cybersecurity perspective of authentication and whatnot, and thinking about whether these applications are actually safe to use. What are the purposes of the application? Going right the way through to what are the developers and the owners of the applications actually using the data that's generated? What are they doing with the data that's generated? How are they interacting? Who are they involved with? There's a big data issue when it comes to these mega companies. I was going to say another word there. These mega companies that are extracting the data and utilize it in other forms. And again, that goes into shaping engagement within the technological sphere as well. So it's quite a complex situation. It's easy to think of it when you think of designing technology for children and young people. You instantly go to the I guess traditional point of view of using toys and this very kind of safe thing. Does it have small parts and choking hazards and those sorts of things? But in the technological space where we're very much out into the world and engaging with an almost unknown population as well, then how do you govern that? How do you manage some of the ideals that we know about when it comes to freedom of speech and expression and encouraging human development and engagement and endeavor, whilst ensuring that it is a safe place to do that, and that the players involved and the designers and the developers involved in creating this space are also singing off the same hymn sheet, so to speak. So
our second speaker is Gisele Waters, who will be talking on human-centered operationalization, care, ethics, and socio-technical challenges, stakeholder preparation. Gisele Waters is the Chief of Service Development and Biomirror Inc. by Design Run Group, a public benefit corporation. She also has several other affiliations, inclusive the business owner of Symbiotica, an innovation research consultancy, and her visiting professorships at Fischler College of Education and the School of Criminal Justice at Nova Southeastern University. She is the working group chair for the IEEE Standards Association Working Group P3119, AI Public Procurement Standard, Anna for Humanity Fellow, and the founder of Engineering Hearts.
Okay, so thank you again. I'm here to present human-centered operationalization, care ethics, and the socio-technical challenges by which we try to begin to create a digital world that children deserve. My focus here today is on the preface, on the prerequisites, on the contingencies for beginning to be able to do this. And so that is stakeholder preparation. So everything that you'll see today is from that point of view. I asked myself when beginning to prepare for this, sort of a little letter to the future about whether or not we can build a digital world with the following specifications. And when I say specifications, I mean the outcomes of what we really are trying to lead to is in this future world. And we can read here for ourselves, but really it's a place where, regardless of the product, service, or system that you are creating, it's really important that at the same time you think about, is this product, service, or system considering the needs of children, preserving their stages of development that are natural, and are their rights being defended, and in general, are they being protected? So creating this digital world is a wicked problem, as Nishan, I think, alluded to, and wicked problems are notoriously and inherently interdependent on other problems, societal problems, cultural problems, and so on and so forth. So there will never be one solution. There will always be the need for a transdisciplinary approach to addressing it with the multiple challenges. And one of the most important things, I believe, is that humans are at the center, often, almost always, of the problems. They are part of the problem, but they are also going to be the forcing functions for parts of the solution. And I'll talk about this later, but we can choose to do nothing in general, which many social media companies do. We can volunteer to change. There's going to be two others. And we can lead digital innovations in this space and volunteer, for example, to implement a standard. Or you can be forced to change to do it. I call them the carrots and sticks. So with that said, I'd like to begin to just talk about care ethics. And care ethics was one of the most comprehensive views on this anyway, was Nell Noddings. And she provided the ideas that the foundation of caring, the foundations of care ethics are the basis for morality. But I'm not going to talk about her theoretical approaches to why care ethics is important. To me, what my interests are is that it helps us better understand the differences between a caring about duty, in other words, you feel a duty to care, or caring as an active choice, an inclination to care purposefully about something. Meaning when you are creating a product, it is in your DNA's individual, group, and cross-functional approach to thinking about it because it's embedded inside your organization. And that any decision that is made in the company, regardless of the product that you're making, that it is not just a duty, but that it's an inclination and you are acting on it. So to me, care ethics is about right conduct. Care ethics is a part of an active choice for consistent, daily, caring actions, and it requires proactive, advanced consideration. So just very quickly, I define it as caring purposefully. So what does this look like? I sort of thought about this and threw this up last night because it's sort of a spectrum. Everything becomes a spectrum, a universe of possibilities of what is. And from the top left to the bottom right, there is a sense of just, I wonder if we could not classify or categorize, but think about that as your indifference as a company to the needs and rights and developmental stages of children, one can think about this top left illustration as sort of a company as well. It's a vast oversimplification, but imagine living next to this person and finding that, it would take 2 extra seconds to sweep the snow off the right side of the stairs. And companies often, in some ways, I wanted to just illustrate this, companies often are just profit focused or efficiency focused. And it is not difficult to surmise that if you are only business and profit focused, that you're not going to care very much about the needs and rights of children as you're developing products, services, and systems. So as indifference and self-interest increases on the left, there's not really a possibility for you to even move into an operationalization of care ethics on the right-hand side. Companies that would pick up the 2089 standard voluntarily, as these standards are, to begin to design and redesign age-appropriate digital services for children, have not only perhaps a duty, but an inclination to. And so from the boardroom all the way down to the lowest salary band, you would have this strength across people in a transdisciplinary way and in a cross-functional way to achieve their goal of listening to and caring for the needs of children. So I assert that organizational identity can be defined by a set of relationships and decisions that describe these three possible states. So what does human-centered operations look like? Well, design is just the beginning. I work in an organization that endeavors and is mission-oriented, and it's a public benefit organization. We're aiming for certification of this charter. And so we try to embed and integrate in a very transdisciplinary, cross-functional, and inter-hierarchical way anything and everything we do, but that it starts with design of the ideal, something that inspires people, meaning we are developing a service, and in that service, we are developing it with either users, customers, end users in mind, thinking about them in advance. But then that is just that. It's a design. It is meant to inspire people to optimize understanding. But then you have this wonderful ideal, and you have to take it to people to implement. And that's when the real challenges begin. Because as design meets reality, and you begin ideating about the business problems, the business viability, the business profit lines, the bottom line, it is almost at its core this struggle between the status quo and what could be. And so when I say ideate after the inspiration and the design occurs, it is a struggle for power. It is a struggle to just change a function on a particular aspect of service, or change a purpose for a particular way that a service is developed. And after that, this clash, if you will, which sometimes is serious and sometimes it's not so serious, we move into implementation. And it is typically that design, the ideal, has been compromised in some really significant ways. And why does this happen? Because human behavior and organizations reflect irrational, multivariable, non-linear dynamical system. And inside these systems, where everyone is struggling to just do their job and have their own bandwidth for time and understand whether their boss knows about the strategy that aims to create a better digital world for children, but that you're trying to implement 15 other programs while you're working, a 10-hour job on that day. These are just the realities. So human-centered operations are an absolute wonderful opportunity to be able to say everything that we do in this company, everything that we do in this operation is a charter and a mission to help whatever vulnerable population choose X. And in this talk, of course, it's for children. But this is sort of the three processes that are continuous, from a daily, almost hourly basis. And even in the most mission-oriented organizations, it is a deep struggle. The 2089 standard, I will let others talk about the process here, but again, it begins with this pre-preparation and these stakeholders, the roles and responsibilities. If the company and organization now have what 2089 suggests, which are an age-appropriate lead, a champion, and that's almost always a relentless C-level top exec or a board member, a system expert that's working on the systems, creating the products, and then potentially a senior product manager. These are just four of the potential roles that are really necessary in designing digital services for children that are age appropriate. But what I alluded to prior was this discussion and constant conversation that is a part of the struggle between design and operations. And it really is about people. It just comes down to, do you have the people that believe? Do you have the people that are going to actively participate in care ethics on a daily basis? And it rolls down to the relationships. It really does. It's human-centered, and the relationships that you create with each and every person in every department, it is exceptionally inevitable that if you have someone that doesn't personify care ethics, it's going to be even harder. So here are the choices that companies have. They can do nothing. They can volunteer to change, meaning carrots attract them, things like standards, guidelines, third-party audits, partnerships with nonprofits, partnerships with NGOs, creating a different charter in your company, for example, or you can lead innovations by doing all of the above as well, or you can be required by law to change, and these are the sticks, of course. Fewer companies are in number 3, some may be in number 2, and of course we know who is in number 1. So this is an interesting idea that really is personified in our company, and that is that there is now certifications in the world for you to be a public benefit corporation. And this nonprofit, the B Corporation, is actually a separate company that helps certify public benefit corporations. And so here is this now spectrum of private sector, profit-focused, self-interest at its highest level, still efficiency-oriented, to the complete opposite potential side of the spectrum with the NGOs and the nonprofits, but companies that actually build a charter to do good. They actually build a charter and have to be certified and get audited in order to do good. And guess what? That space is expanding, and that is exciting. So we have a lot of things at our disposal, a lot of tools, because this wicked problem needs them all, and they need them all the time. And it will take generations. This is not a one solution, one-stop shop here, but you have wonderful things going on that can help folks design and create and change and redesign and go back to old legacy systems and also redesign those. And these are some of the carrots. But we also have what happens with indifference. And at the top of the indifference, when you are only profit focused, what happens is the law comes in, some sticks are needed. And whilst the US has been a little bit slow to address what the needs of children are, California has this wonderful new law, which most likely will end up at the governor's desk by September. But really, this is a chance to secure best in nation online protections for children in California, as well as a new regulatory standard for the US. And it's based on the Children's Code, of course, inspired by Baroness Beban and all of her work in legislation in the UK. But what this signals to the US, California does, usually the US considers after. What's the signals is we are going to use the law as a tool to help you understand the needs and rights of children. And so that's where we're at. Big big hello. History teaches us that law is helpful to protect the rights of others, consumers, children in this case. And these latest settlements are very indicatory of things are changing, and regulation will help. It is not the end all and be all, but it will help. And so these are some of the highest penalties now seen. And I suspect that they will get more lawsuits. And even just recently, in 2020 in New Mexico, in the United States, they're suing Google for collecting children's data in schools. And this lawsuit is ongoing. This is that force. It's a force of nature, hopefully, that says, hey, you don't want to do it, that's fine, but let's find out how we can change your behavior. And so that's it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I extended my time way too much, but I appreciate your attention and the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Gisele. Our third speaker is Ephraim Luwemba of Horizon at the University of Nottingham. In his PhD at Nottingham University, Ephraim has partnered with the Five Rights Foundation, a charity created by Baroness Beban Kidron with a mission to articulate the rights of children in the digital environment. In early 2021, Ephraim completed his internship at Five Rights.
All right. Thank you everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak, Katina as well, and thank you for the presentations that we've had so far. I found them very thought-provoking, and my work is going to bring it almost to the ground, in the sense that I'm focusing on a study that I've done as part of my PhD. And really looking at a very particular area of legislation and guidance around privacy and the use of children's data online. The reason that I wanted to focus on this topic is because I think it's useful to have an idea of what things look like on the ground in the sphere that we're in. And the reality is that in a lot of the areas that we're working in, there hasn't actually been that much work on the ground done by organizations and platforms to change the way that they address the children that are on their platforms. And I think there are various reasons for that. And Gisele's talk about the very real institutional challenges that are faced goes some way to explaining it. And what I wanted to do in this study that I did is to outline the areas where we are falling short of the very good guidance and legislation that already exists, as well as the things that are coming into play, such as P289, to give us even more things to lean upon and things to draw upon when we're designing services for young children. So the background of this study is that I was concerned with the challenge of consent online, and this is a real issue that's been talked about for a long time in privacy literature. The main problem that we're talking about here is that a very prominent legal basis for using the data of people is the consent that they provide to things such as terms and conditions, privacy notices, and cookie notices. And children are included in this as well because of the lack of safeguards and lack of age checks and the ease with which they can circumvent these sorts of things. And even though most of the privacy notices that we come across online are aimed towards adults, the reality we all know is that children are also engaging with these things. And on websites where they are more likely to be the users that the organization is dealing with, it's important that they understand how to design effective notices for them as well. So as I said, the problem of notice and consent has received much airtime in the literature around it within privacy scholarship. And the main reason for this is that the notices that we come across online are long and difficult to read most of the time. They often have dark patterns built into them that make it the case that they actually incentivize people not to read them. And consequently, for the most part, scholarship has shown that internet users don't read the notices that they come across. There's been a lot of things written around how to change the transparency mechanisms that we have. Of course, recently we've had various bits of legislation that talk about transparency as well and give their own voices of guidance, such as the UK GDPR code, the GDPR itself, and the children's code that was mentioned by Gisele. So what I wanted to do in the work that I am talking about today is have a look at the different forms of guidance that exist around presenting information about processing of data on several platforms, and see to what extent the practice in the real world actually follows any of this guidance. So the types of notice presentation that I looked at are presented in this ontology. You have things such as privacy management tools, so dashboards that are created for the purpose of making privacy choices easier, which you often see in cookie consent mechanisms and things like that. Presentation aids such as last opportunity warnings, which tell you that this is your last opportunity to read the notice that you're looking at, displaying how readable it is, making sure that you can read the privacy notice in one bite as opposed to by clicking into it. Summaries and visualizations, which are explicitly recommended for presenting privacy information to children in the GDPR. So you have things like illustrations, nutrition labels, icons, comic-based privacy notices was one of the things that was suggested. So you have all of these different ways that scholars and legislators have come up with for presenting the information in a privacy notice. And what I wanted to do was understand to what extent any of this had been adopted by platforms. So the main thing that I did was take 123 websites based upon their popularity and how likely it was for young people to engage with the website. And I used Alexa Rank, which no longer exists actually, but at the time it was a method of gauging the popularity of a website based upon Amazon's algorithms. And so I looked at 123 websites, 8 social media platforms also. I won't go into which exact ones they were, and assessed the privacy policies based upon 8 different attributes. So how the policy was positioned on the website, so that's a proxy for accessibility of the privacy policy. How it was formatted, whether it used any of the presentation features I mentioned in the last slide, the level of formality, which was based on a range of features that I took from design guidelines, how long the policy was, both in terms of word count and how long an estimated reading time would be, whether it contained any safeguards against underage access, and I had quite a low bar for this. It was what Nishan suggested, actually, in the sense that if a privacy policy simply had something stating that if you are under the age of 13, then you shouldn't access this policy, then that would be classed as a safeguard. I wanted to make it easy to assess in that sense, and then whether there was anything indicating that the privacy notice was aimed towards young people, and that's basically in the language that was used, and also the readability of the notice. And I had two criteria for this. One was a criteria for the absolute youngest that you'd expect any website to claim that they're serving to, which is an 8th grade criterion. So that's privacy notices that could be understood by anybody who is 13 or over. And then a slightly harder criterion, which is privacy policies that could be understood by anybody who's around the age of 18, so 12th grade criterion. And these were, I used well-known readability indices, such as SMOG, Coleman Lau, Gunning Fog, and Flesch to determine this. So what I found when looking at these 123 notices is probably what the people who have been reading in this area for a long time would expect. It was much of the same. So there wasn't much difference between the presentation, the contents of, and the readability of the privacy policies that were on websites that were aimed towards young children versus the average for these properties on policies that are on adult websites or websites that aren't quite targeted towards young children. I think the positioning and presentation of notices, they were generally hard to access. They were either at the bottom of the page, which isn't that bad in the sense that most people know to look at the bottom of a website in order to access a privacy notice. But in some cases, you also found privacy notices hidden in secondary menus and things like that. And often the cookie notice offers the option to go to the privacy notice, but usually a cookie notice contains the sorts of dark patterns that I was mentioning before, which invite the user to just click on and accept the terms. The age appropriateness of the content was an interesting thing to look at. So there was only one policy amongst the 123 that I looked at that actually directly addressed the children who were the majority of their users. And in that case, actually, the policy didn't directly say to them, okay, so this is how I'm going to use your personal information, and these are the different details that we have. It was more to tell them that if you have a parent near you, please go get them so that they can read the main privacy notice for you and make this decision for you. And I've actually got a couple of examples of what that looks like within a privacy notice. So if you're a parent or guardian and you're aware that your child has providers with personal data without your consent, please contact us. If we become aware that we've collected personal data from children without parental consent, we take steps to remove the information from our servers. But you find information like this repeatedly within the the content of a privacy notice that's hidden behind all of these layers, and not as something that's child-facing on websites that you visit. The thing that I just read out was from the website Bulba Garden, which is an encyclopedia for Pokemon, which has a forum attached to it, and several things. The problem that we found in some of these cases was that if you have that information within a privacy notice, as opposed to on the homepage of the website, or during the standard onboarding procedure that a site has, wherever it is, it's very unlikely that a child will be able to access the privacy notice, read to the point where it says they should get a parent, and then go fetch their parent. It just indicates that the sites, in many cases, weren't actually trying too hard to make it the case that a child and parent could sit through this and understand the effects that the child might have under them based upon the privacy notice. The last thing that I found, which was actually quite shocking to me, in the sense that I was looking at young people's websites, was that the majority of the websites that I looked at didn't even meet the criterion of being readable for people who are over the age of 18. So the majority had a criterion that was above the 12th grade criterion for readability, meaning that none of them were readable by anybody 13 or younger. And what this indicated, going back to what I said before, is that in a lot of cases, the privacy notices aren't written with even the assumption that a child might want to gain access to it, might gain any benefit from gaining access to it. And if they do gain access to it, it's largely assumed that a parent will be there to read the privacy notice alongside the child, and try to understand it that way. So really, in most of the cases that I looked at, there was not much indication that much had changed about the presentation of privacy information, even given the fact that the GDPR had been put into play, and you would expect some sort of changes for that reason. There were a couple of cases where we saw that perhaps the GDPR had some effect. There's this example that I pull out often of the Nat Geo US website versus the Nat Geo UK or EU website, and the cookie notice that's present in both those cases. So there's a very common, I would call it a dark pattern, present on the US website, or it was present on the US website at the time that I looked at it, which is that there was a cookie banner that only gives you the option of placing cookies upon the website. And this is a common way of presenting cookie information on certain websites, making it very difficult for a user to really express their preferences for data collection. But I found that in the case of the Nat Geo website that was in the UK, they actually had this wonderful banner that gives you the options of not accepting data collection via cookies, or not accepting non-essential cookies, I should say. And if you can see, the language that's used in this case was also more child-friendly. This actually, this part of my 8th grade criterion, for example. And so there's some indication that legislation change, so actually using the stick method that Gisele talked about, can have a positive effect in some cases. but I found that this was the exception rather than the rule. I'm finished with the accounting of my study, but where I wanted to come with this was to understand the ways that the design of consent mechanisms online is affected by the different guidance that is available to the individuals who create these sorts of platforms. And as part of that, one of the studies that I'm now conducting is to talk to professionals and people who are in the area of design, for example, so designers who help design websites, software developers, legal professionals who draft consent notices, to understand what challenges that they face, whether they be institutional challenges, technical challenges, or challenges understanding the legislation that they come across. And what I've understood from the work that is ongoing so far is that in a lot of cases, things like the IEEE P289 standard, the guidance that is present outside of explicit legal guidance, so things like the GDPR, is often difficult to access for technical professionals, in the sense that they don't often know where to turn. So in most of the cases that I talk to people who create websites that serve young people, they said that usually that they'll look to blogs and services like that, so Stack Exchange, etc., to design these sorts of mechanisms. So I think an important point to keep in mind is that in a lot of cases, the people who would most benefit from the sort of guidance that we're pushing with P289, with other projects that I've worked on that look at transparency, especially, it's not the case that they're always the most well informed about the changes in research and the changes in best practice outside of their specific domains. And that's something that I'd be interested to talk with the panel about, how you overcome the boundaries in communication that exist. That's all I had for now.
Thank you so much, Ephraim. How comprehensive was that? And what a lady was from the design of Gisele and the problem space identified by Nishan. Over to Reese now to close off the panel with the last presentation before we go to Q&A. Reese is a self-identified policy wonk who focuses on children's rights, especially around technology and the disadvantaged. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, where she was a Clarendon Scholar, and the Masters of Science from the London School of Economics. Reese has held policy roles at civil society organizations like Reset Tech, Five Rights Foundation and Fair Play, and the APPG on poverty. She has also held academic posts at Oxford and RMIT, and is a research associate at the Information Law and Policy Centre at the University of London. Welcome, everyone, and great to be with you today.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me and for inviting me here. I'm going to start off, if I can, a little bit off piece and talk a little bit about how we position young people and their experiences in the digital world. And I'm going to open with a super bold statement, and that is, bear with me, the digital world offers huge opportunities for young people, and we can and should be unleashing innovation to really maximize these opportunities. The digital space, it can be an incredibly amazing vehicle to both realize and advance young people's rights, whether that's their right to information, to education, to leisure, to expression, their rights to the future, if you will. It offers this, I don't know what you'd call it, like a comprehensive vision of citizenship that the old, in real life world just hasn't been able to give them. young people have for a long time been denizens of the sort of real world, politically disenfranchised and too often marginalised. And the digital world offers a chance to really challenge some of these practices that sees young people systemically left out. Now, that thought, I think starting from that position, is possibly a really fruitful way to reopen up the conversation, to reopen up our question and answer session, because it's less about protecting children in the digital world, which is a kind of sort of, I don't know, like a fear-based nervous framing that leads us to try and think about like minimums of protections and what we can do, to a positive, really active framing that opens up the possibility of thinking about maximums of capability, if you will. So Nishan opened up, you know, by talking about needing to move from, what was it, I think it was like a cybersecurity framing to a sort of more comprehensive framework. I'm suggesting we go beyond that again and move beyond safety into a kind of children and young people as rights-bearing citizens perspective. And this opens up a lot more space for young people's agencies. They aren't passive, you know, non-player characters in this digital world that we're all running to try and save. They're agentic and can and should be active parts of making this new digital world. And so they're not our children to protect, they're their own people. As Gisele described this, it's stakeholder preparation taken to its sort of logical end conclusion. And when we start from there, the sort of task, I think, of, I don't know, of like realising and advancing young people's privacy and addressing the very real risks of social media becomes a slightly more involved, but definitely more exciting process. And the risks are real. I'm not sort of glossing over that in some sort of Pollyanna-ish, you know, tech utopianism. I've been asked to sort of describe some of the risks that I've uncovered in micro experiments and research projects. And I will talk about 3 of them. But what I want to do is reframe them a little bit and think about how seeing young people as non-player characters in and of itself might have contributed to that risk, and how flipping our vision might help prevent some of these risks in the first place. So the 3 risks that I've been documenting recently that young people experience in terms of privacy and social media specifically are firstly in July, earlier July this year, so just a few weeks ago, working with a consortium of organisations across 14 different countries, I wrote a short report looking at what we've described as design discriminations, or the different levels of safety and privacy that platforms offer young people based on where they're from. So we documented, for example, that if a 17-year-old is in Germany and they open up a new Instagram account, Instagram defaults that account to a private account because, paraphrasing from Instagram's own blog here, private accounts are one of the best ways to prevent unwanted contact between minors and stranger adults. But if a 17-year-old in Ghana or Indonesia or even the US opens up an account on Instagram, they don't get defaulted to private. They just get a little screen allowing them to choose between private or public. So this choice of what happens to 17-year-olds' accounts embodies a direct conflict between young people's best interests, which are better served by private accounts that maximise both privacy and safety, and commercial interests, which are better served with public accounts that maximise engagement, if you will. And in some countries, platforms are choosing young people's best interests, while in other countries, those same platforms are prioritising their commercial interests. It's Gisele's half-swept stares in actions. But where platforms are choosing young people's best interests, it's not by random. Design discriminations largely affect young people outside of Europe, because Europe's regulators have acted to demand these sort of minimums of protection. It's the stick, as Gisele put it. And let me be clear, the stick works. We've seen this as proof that the stick, more than anything else, drives up the protections that we've got. But why is it that young people elsewhere don't have their rights realised by these companies in the same way? I mean, sure, there's the kind of obvious one of, you know, the business model sucks. Corporate greed means that they'll put their best interests first. There's the kind of obvious one. But at a more philosophical level, are what we're seeing, you know, is this the kind of inevitable consequence, if you will, of the game that we're playing, the game of young people's privacy and safety, being played by these characters of advocates, lawmakers, regulators, big tech, and we're all gaming away to see what we can secure against our own set of priorities. What would happen if young people were agentic characters too? What if, would Instagram or TikTok or WhatsApp have thought fundamentally differently about turning on or off features in a limited way based entirely on the demands of regional regulators? I guess what I'm asking is, it's a big question of how did we get here? How did we get to a place where publicly listed companies are choosing not to turn on privacy and safety enhancing features for African and Asian young people? Does young people's systemic long-term lack of power, their lack of visibility, their lack of agency have anything to do with that? The second risk that I wanted to flag and look at really quickly is how young people's data is harvested, then twisted and too often used in ways to profile them and create personal risks. So data that's pickpocketed from young people by the left hand is then packaged up and used to sell them back risks with the right hand. So I'm talking about things here like the ways young people's data is used by social media platforms to drive algorithms that serve them risky content or to drive algorithms that advertise risky products. And I've run experiments in the last 6 months on both TikTok and Instagram that show that both of these companies will harvest data about 13-year-olds about what they like and do online and use this data to recommend increasing levels of risky content, whether it's pro-eating disorder content, manosphere content, or content that reinforces problematic ethnic stereotypes. Now, this isn't a sort of generic whine about these companies hosting awful content that bad people post. It's about these companies actively choosing to recommend this content to young people and doing so in ways that identifies and preys on their vulnerability to this awful content in the first place. And with exponential accuracy, whichever way you run these experiments, these companies will recommend increasing amounts of troubling content for kids to watch. So in one experiment, for example, that we undertook a couple of months ago, I looked at politically divisive content, think white supremacy content, QAnon content, that sort of content in Australia. We looked at how algorithms were feeding it, and we also polled young people to see how far it spread. And we found that over 3/4 of 16 and 17-year-olds in our poll had seen this content. And we asked where and how they'd seen it. We found that half of the young people who had seen politically divisive content said they saw it because an algorithm said they should discover it. A further quarter said they saw it because they followed someone and an algorithm therefore placed it in their followers' feed. So this isn't about young people going looking for this sort of politically divisive content. It's about platforms' algorithms actively profiling young people as potentially interested in this sort of divisive, problematic content and serving it right up. In other contexts, we'd call this behaviour grooming. And I'm going to quote Kelsey here, who's an amazing 17-year-old advocate from California, who described what it was like to have an Instagram feed filled with eating disorder content. She said, "I knew I couldn't rely on Instagram to send me the positive messages I needed. I had to actively try and change my social media feeds. I had to do the hard work. Without my consent, Instagram pushes me towards it, but I have to pull myself away from it." Again, how did we get here? Would it be different if young people were seen as key stakeholders and had to be heard, had to input into the discussions about how algorithms really should rank content? And thirdly, third risk I want to highlight really quickly, because I'm just going to back Ephraim in here when he talks about consent and terms and conditions. Again, while I think that consent is actually a really weak proposition to justify data collection, it is, as Ephraim noticed, the dominant legal and moral justification that we have. And this is, in so many ways, this is deeply problematic. Can you ever consent to egregious violations of your rights? What does declining to consent look like in a digital world? Do you really have the option to decline? But let's take it at face value. In a quick report I authored last year called "Did We Really Consent to This?", we looked at the policies that 10 different platforms offer young users. We found, again, as Ephraim did, 90% of them required a tertiary degree to read. And one of them was one platform was just shy as being as long as 2 high school novels as recommended by the Australian Department of Education. Unsurprisingly, when we polled young people again, only 4% of teenagers said they read the terms and conditions that they agreed to. So can we really say that young people consented to this data collection and use? You know, when what they've consented to isn't even presented to them in a way that would enable meaningful consent. And no surprises here. I think that if we did flip the script a little bit and understand young people as agentic actors, as active stakeholders, no one will be drafting 47,000 words of terms and conditions for them to read. And that is the length of TikTok's terms and conditions. I'm not just making that number up. So I think, I mean, overall, I think that if young people were repositioned, if we did see young people as not as non-player characters, but as active characters, as people who were engaged in designing and building this digital world, a lot of these sorts of risks would be mitigated. They simply wouldn't be designed in the first place. But it would also go a long way to that more positive vision of reshaping the digital world in ways that unlocks and advances young people's rights in the first place. So I think what I'm calling for, I'm deeply aware that what I'm calling for is a fundamental big rethink. But ultimately, I think that that is possibly the most powerful intervention and really the only way to reshape the digital world in a way that makes it genuinely work for everyone. So I think that was my big challenge, my big proposition, and I'd love to open it up to discussion at this point.
Thank you so much, Reese and Ephraim and Gisele and Nishan. What a riveting 4 presentations that was, and I think we can definitely dovetail off that last big question from Reese Farthing.
Inclusive development and business development of proprietary technology and market advantage isn't a dichotomy. I think what is seen usually is that businesses tend to create this wall or this fence that's very much they're protective of their algorithms, their technology, and whatever they're developing to gain advantage. And the fear is, well, if I let people in to have a look at how I've designed this, then they, you know, with a cybersecurity hat on, they might take that away and reverse engineer my valued algorithm to then run their own platform. Where actually, if we knock down those walls and create a bit of an inclusive ecosystem where, you know, transdisciplinary, but also bringing in kids, young people, you know, I mean, all of these mechanisms, you know, it's not reinventing the wheel because you have target focus groups and everything else. But as part of that, and with what Gisele was alluding to with the design cycle, is, you know, being able to engage with these folks to actually build things that make sense and actually just, you know, not have this engineering groupthink of let's just build something this way without any kind of contemplation of what the consequences could be. I mean, I appreciate we're all, a lot of this is unknown and, you know, it's not a bug, it's a feature, you know, that kind of mentality, right? With every design cycle, you're going to come across things that you didn't intend, but how we react to that and how, you know, rather than just trying to block things off and whatnot, why don't we just work in a way that makes sense? And I think really, and that comes from both a security point of view. A lot of security practitioners do this anyway when you open source code and have a lot of ways of trying to find bugs and develop new security algorithms and whatnot. And that, you know, why not use that same type of methodology elsewhere? So that's really my push, is just to stop being scaredy cats and actually just, you know, engage with people. The people are here, you know, there's people on this panel, our wider affiliates, users that, you know, that use the technologies. I'm sure a lot of users that engage with these platforms would actually, like the example you gave, Reese, the individual that was suffering from the content that she was being, or they were being fed, to be able to empower that individual to actually be able to feed back in a way that actually brings about positive change. So actually, you know, the platform is delivering, well, not just what they want to see, because you don't want to create echo chambers, but creating content that's, you know, positive and actually what the person wants. I think that's the thing when you talk about consent as well, right? So it's, I don't want to kind of dilute my message into too many different points, but it's about user-driven content and engagement and consent. When you're consenting to something, that you're actually getting what you're agreeing to. You're not just agreeing to just fly off into the ether, and come what may, whatever you get, and it serves you right for agreeing. And if you don't agree, then well, you know where to go. Uninstall Facebook or this thing, and then you won't have you won't be exposed to this mayhem, right? It's real change in mindset, which I think is what you're also advocating.
Can I just pick up on that and ask a question there? And I'd love to sort of, building on what you said, Nish, but I'd love to get Ephraim's thoughts, and then Gisele's, as well, as someone who sort of, thinks about the process of building things. You mentioned there, Nishan, this is about getting what you consented to. But I'd love to know, what do we actually think of the consent framework when it comes to sort of young people? Like, is it the right framework? And we're just going about collecting consent wrong? Or is consent, wrong? Like, do we need to be moving towards what the sort of more consumer law process, which is it doesn't matter about consent. This is actually about the terms, the terms, if you will. But is the offer fair? Is it right? Does it work for you? And Ephraim, as someone who sort of works day in, day out, looking at this consent framework and identifying, if you will, the bugs in the framework, could we fix the framework and make it right? Or is consent just the wrong way to think about this when it comes to young people?
I think in my experience, especially actually talking to people who have the they have the burden of actually trying to write consent notices and things like that. In a lot of cases, the struggle to kind of just tick all the boxes that are required, even by relatively useful legislation like the GDPR. It seems that the struggle is always balancing business interests and balancing the interests of the consumer, and the business interests often they'll be at the top, because if people aren't afraid of getting sued or moving in ways that don't protect them, then they're afraid of using the resources required to make things really palatable to the user. And I think in most of the discussions that I've had with people who write notices, there's also a reluctance to move in ways that are creative and use methods that could be more understandable to users, because they're not sure, A, if it's compliant, B, if the type of framework that they're using will work in the way that they expect it to work. So whether the user will actually find it more useful. And then I think in a lot of cases they also think from a user's perspective, it won't really make much of a difference. And sorry for the long-winded examples I gave, but I think for me, the consent framework is only useful in certain fixed circumstances. I mean, it's good when you're talking about real choices that the user has, and kind of consent that they have to give for specific purposes, maybe once or twice in the user journey. I think a good example of that is like actually consent for advertising purposes. If that's made really clear to even a younger user, they understand like the context surrounding it, for something like Spotify, for example. And so because they understand the context surrounding it, they can make that decision. They can go back to the decision if the tool is made clear. But I think broad consent is definitely something that's difficult to work with. If you're thinking about consenting to whole agendas and whole regimes of data processing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. So there's some innate problems with the consent framework. You know, it works in certain places, but perhaps the way it's used as the dominant legal or moral, if you will, basis for processing, you know, some of those problems are perhaps intractable. I don't know, Gisele, I mean, what do you think? Should we abandon consent and move towards fair terms only? Like, is that possibly one way forward in improving the systems and digital services that young people are offered?
No, I don't think you should abandon consent. I think, you know, consent has been used in really, really successful ways in human subjects research. And I think that we need to kind of come back to the idea that any product, services system that's created has exponential, as you say, accuracy in impacting, you know, billions of people in some ways. TikTok being one example in terms of its reach and bandwidth. So it's this: how do we really implement consent that's meaningful? How is it that we engage in terms and conditions in a way that is meaningful and comprehensible? I think that's probably less difficult than this entry point of the why for most businesses. But no, we should not abandon consent. I think it's got a good, strong history across a variety of things that are important, which are when you get on this product, when you do this, when you're participating in studies, when you're about to give your genetic DNA, when in any sector, consent is an important process. We just really haven't systematized in a cross-functional way across jurisdictions how to do this in a fair, meaningful, and comprehensive way. I think one of the things that, you know, I'm going to be, I'm too young to figure this out. As I said before in my talk, this is going to take generations. This is, I mean, this is a long, wicked problem that will not go away. And I don't think I'm going to see the digital world that children deserve. But yes, consent, please. Absolutely.
Nishan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say we need to abandon consent, but I think we need to just I don't want to say redefine, because it's not that we're redefining consent, but it's just about how we use consent in these frameworks. Because at the minute, as Ephraim has pointed out, the consent is, do you agree with this? And oh, you can click here, and if you click here, you get the 47,000 words that you need legal representation to try and figure out what on earth it is you're agreeing to. And if you agree, then in you go, and then again, it's the Wild West. Or if you don't agree, then no fun, no access. So I think there's degrees. So yes, you agree, that needs to be simplified. What are you actually agreeing to? But also, once you're in, so to speak, and you're using this, there might be elements of it that you don't agree with, and you don't want your data being shared with X party, or you don't want to, access to certain material, or whatever it is. So it's not a binary yes, no thing. I mean, I think of consent, there's the analogy of making a cup of tea. I think that was used more relating to like kind of personal interactions, let's say, rather than in this space. But I think that's the issue where they're using a very, very basic iteration of something to solve the problem, where actually it's a lot more complex. And especially when the technology, as we said earlier on, the technology has evolved. You know, Facebook, to use as an example, there are other social media platforms available. But if you imagine when it started as, I mean, I'm an oldie, so I joined Facebook in its inception back in 2004, I think it was, when it was the inter-university network, and you had to be in a university in North America in order to get access. And it was just very much the yellow pages of students, right? And then it's evolved into the Franken monster that it is now. But you can do all sorts of things. But I think people of our generation, I think, have, because as we've interacted with it early on, and we kind of, for me at least, and with my background, when I interact with Facebook, I know what I'm interacting with, what they're doing, and I can pull back and choose what I share or don't share, or whatever else. But people that are born into it as digital citizens, I guess, if you're born into it and you're utilizing it, and that's a primary source of interaction and engagement, then it's difficult to, I guess consent as we know it doesn't necessarily apply in that space, because you're asking someone, do you want to communicate with your friends or not? You know, it's not rather than, do you want to just use this social media platform or not? So it's a totally different context. So I think that's one of the things. It's absolutely consent is there, but it just needs to be reimagined. It makes me think of, it's like the conversation around privacy versus agency, right? I think for a long time, privacy was, I withhold my information, and so if I withhold my information, I'm secure and you're never going to get it. But I think we can all safely say that the majority of agencies and organizations out there have elements of our data in some way, shape or form, or some digital profile. And now it's the conversation of, well, what are they actually doing with it? I accept you have that information, but I want to make sure that you don't then sell that on to someone else, at least without my consent. Or if you are going to use it for monetary reasons, then why can't I have a piece of that pie? Why should you make money out of the information that I'm generating and I'm not benefiting from that information? So this is the complexity, I think, of it. That and again, I mean, not to say that there's a simple solution to that, but these are wicked problems, and we're, a lot of the time, they're just working on the bare minimum just to tick that box to say, yes, we've complied, we put that barrier there, or we put that message to say, do you agree with whatever else? I'm sure a lot of people would hate the fact that government agencies in Finland sell data to marketing agencies, and when you log on to the service, you have to agree to that. That doesn't make sense. So yeah, that's a different conversation. But I think this is, in my view at least, I think that's what we really need to figure out. How, where's the Goldilocks point? How do we do it in a way that's fair and not exploitative, I guess?
Yeah, I guess that's the key question, isn't it? Can a young person ever consent to being exploited? And it sort of raises some fundamental pieces. I'm just wondering, I'll give a gap there for the editing. Do you want me to just ask one more question of all of us, and then we've sort of got, Katina's got some content to run with for Q&A?
Sure.
Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good.
That sounds
I've got
good.
a hard stop at 8, so no problem.
Brilliant.
Answer quickly.
Brilliant. All right. I mean, I'm just wondering, Nishan, you raised an interesting point there where you talked about, this is about, well, you used the concept of people profiting from data. Well, why can't I have some of that profit? Which I think, more interestingly for me, sort of raises a question of, the proprietary nature of personal data. Whose data is it? And if it's our data, which I think under most data protection regimes that exist in the world, it sort of suggests that personal data is, belongs to the person. Do social media companies, because that's what we're talking about today, social media companies, do they have some sort of fiduciary responsibility? Do they have a responsibility to use that data only in ways that benefits us? Like, are they caretakers of that data? And is that potentially a better way around if the conversation starts from, well, you are using my data, you have responsibilities to use my data well. is that potentially a better way to position the start of these conversations about their obligations to young people? Gisele, I mean, as someone who works in the, you know, the sort of thick of it around thinking about how we design and build this, would that be a better starting point?
You know, that's a deep question. If how to begin, I think the design is just a forcing mechanism for the consideration of the child in this case. But I'll default back to, I think companies will not ever think that they have fiduciary duty to protect unless they're forced to do so, generally speaking. But again, we can go back to what Nishan said originally, and I completely agree and necessarily didn't highlight in mine, which was profit and commercial interests and the purpose of protecting children, at least from a fiduciary perspective, are not exclusive. They're not dichotomous. They don't have to exist separately. You can do both. You can protect and you can make money. It's as simple as that. These companies, often the largest that is, make, you know, more than countries. And it's not that they don't have the resources. So, but I think that you're, like any industry, like any large corps, like any large commercial interests, history has shown us that typically the legislation has to force them to protect. And that's just, you know, I don't know what that is. It's just some weird, horrible, dark part of humanity.
I think the where I struggle with things like that is it depends which personal data you're talking about. In most cases, sure, I'm sure, because there are certain categories of personal data where you would not make that case. For example, medical data and probably the sort of data that can be used against you, such as data that can identify you in some cases. Probably not your address, since I suppose a lot of organizations have access to that sort of data, but things like financial data and national identity data as well. And in all those cases, it wouldn't be a fiduciary duty so much as a duty of care. And I think when you're talking about young people specifically, it's almost like asking whether you should bribe them to have access to their data, because in a lot of the cases that I can think of where you would talk about fiduciary responsibility, young people, I'd probably default to duty of care still. If that makes any sense. I'm not sure if an example would be useful for it. But I think ultimately what I'm saying is that in a case where you're talking about uses of data that pertains to adults, I'm much more comfortable thinking of a company's fiduciary responsibility to them. But in the case of data for young people, I'm almost always drawn to think of them having a duty of care to the data, because even with benign data, often you can think about kind of maybe like the long-term consequences of data uses that young people may have to deal with when they're adults and they have different priorities and things like that. But I think my response is a bit abstract in a sense. I'll be interested to see what people think about that duty of care idea though instead.
No, I think, yeah, I think that's perhaps a step in the right direction in terms of framing these entities or these orgs to utilize or at least be inspired by a fiduciary type of approach. But as Ephraim just said, that having a duty of care, because when you're talking about adults, that's one thing, and then children something else. And if children, for all intents and purposes, can't legally consent, so to speak, then the platform has a duty of care on how they use their data and how they interact with the kids and all the rest of it. But I think that's the thing. Up until this point, I don't believe. I think these orgs, these entities, these platforms have shied away from the responsibility of that is required for being a fiduciary. It reminds me of the Shaggy song. It wasn't me. And every time they fall foul of something, every platform's like, oh, it wasn't me. I didn't do. Oh, that wasn't designed that way. Everyone's quick to try and avoid the thing, as opposed to taking responsibility and thinking about what could happen and how do we mitigate that, how do we protect the user, and thinking about data itself, and with my previous kind of experience hat on, when it comes to identifiable data, I mean, medical data is just a tip of the iceberg when you're thinking about Spotify usage and the psychometric profiles that Spotify creates based on your listening habits and your and the other platforms and your browsing habits, and how that's all unified together to create these profiles on individuals. And there is, I guess, at least seen to be huge value in profiling children and young people who are going to be the future consumers. And why not to start using some I guess worrying terms. Essentially, I think a lot of these organizations are essentially grooming kids to be their devout followers and customers and users for when they are of service buying or consumer buying age, so to speak, whatever that may be. But getting them whilst they're young, so that they are, and especially with think of other things with brand power and everything else. But a lot of people have they follow certain things, they use certain platforms that they're influenced by influencers and whatever else, so they're trying to really capitalize on that and keeping, as long as they have people that are loyal to the platform, anything goes. I think in there. So the fiduciary thing, I think, is what I would like to see, at least as part of a step where platforms acknowledge that they have a responsibility to govern the space. Because so many times we hear it, don't we, if there's an issue, especially when it's politically related, this is more adult sphere, but the platforms say, well, we're just a platform, we don't govern the message, we don't govern the content, we're just here to do our thing, and it's up to the people to figure that out. And it's I disagree with that personally, but yeah, that's just my take on it.
Yeah, I put that on there because genomics, in terms of its significance and importance, even in that medical space, we're having problems with consent. When it will impact you because you have the most personal, private information that has tremendous significant impact on all aspects of your life. Even there, we've got issues, but folks are starting to think about how consents are, this is not a static event, but rather this continuous ability to say, you got my data, okay, now you're going to use my data, potentially another consent, and now you're going to share my data, this is another consent, and it's a continuous conversation. Consent is a conversation across these acts or processes. And I think for children, in terms of product, services, and systems, consent for how their data is collected, used, and shared, and then sold, should also be a conversation that does not stop at the beginning of accepting an app or at the beginning of starting to use an app. But again, forcing functions have to be required most likely.
And I guess just on that, it just makes you think of when, like I say, having this continual mechanism or approach to consent, but also the ability to withdraw consent as well. Because it might be that what you agree to, even if it's later down the line and you've agreed to some kind of data sharing or whatever, it might be that we're all human. In a month's time, in 6 months' time, actually, I don't want to be sharing that anymore.
Right.
And there are some platforms that do these privacy reminders and review your apps that you've given permissions for, whatever, but I don't think it's far enough. And there are plenty of things, again, that people have agreed to, maybe in just in that quick moment, just to get access to something, and then they forget that that permission or that consent is there, and 4 years later, the consent was there, so they've still got access. So yeah, being able to change your mind, I think, is key as well.
If you had a single message for Silicon Valley, what would it be? Yes.
I think my message would be that you need to build a positive digital world, and you need to include young people in that process of building it. Nothing else is going to last the test of time. Nothing else is going to cut it, and nothing else is truly going to be sustainable.
Gisele Waters, if you could give a single message to Silicon Valley, what would it be?
Like it or not, change is coming, whether by force or by choice. So, wait for what you have to do, or try to think about and do everything that you need in order to look at the agency that children have and the impact of your products on them. Other people's children are your children, because children are our future. So that was it.
Thank you. Ephraim Luwemba, if you had one message for Silicon Valley, what would it be?
Well, I think mine was actually very similar to Gisele's, in the sense that I think that the way things are going, you have all of these different moves that are being made to make the world safer for children. And from what I've seen, a lot of the innovation that's happening is trailing behind the need for change and the want for change that we see. And so it's important that you bring in the young people who are on your platforms, bring them in as decision makers, as actual contributors to the design of your platforms. I think it's so important to have real engaged discussions between platforms and users in order to transform the way that that things are done, because the users understand their problems better than anybody else. So young people are no different.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Nishan Chelvachandran, if you had a single message for Silicon Valley, what would it be?
Well, to put it in one message, it would be, oh, is my voice, okay, hang on.
Your single message would be, give us £1 million or we'll hack you all.
My single message, and clearly Silicon Valley are listening if my voice is getting interrupted. No, it would be, and I can re-record this again if you want, but it's really that there isn't a dichotomy between business propriety and inclusivity. You can be inclusive of open up your design process and technological development, without seemingly giving away your industry secrets. It can be competitive. You can still be market competitive and market driven whilst operating in a way that is inclusive and opening up the walled garden of design.
Nishan, I think you've just demonstrated how some parents and children interpret terms and conditions. It's pretty much what it sounds like when we read them, right? If we get to the end. But sorry to interrupt you there, but friends, if you like what you've heard today, please come in person or view online our IEEE International Symposium on Digital Privacy and Social Media, to be held on the 1st of August in San Jose's Marriott Hotel. We'd love to have you there and love the support that you could provide these speakers and the future of our children, present, past and future, actually, in coming to listen to these pertinent conversations. Thank you.